St. Paul's, you know all of my favorite jokes by now. Here's one of them. There are two kinds of people in the world. Those who believe you can divide the world into two kinds of people, and everybody else. There are also two ways to hear this morning's psalm. Both are explained by the 16th verse. Come and hear, all you who fear God. Come and hear, and I will tell you what he has done for me. The first way is obvious. This psalm is all joyful thanksgiving, praise to God for carrying Israel through all kinds of afflictions. What has God done for me? He has saved our lives and kept our feet from slipping. He brought us to a place of abundance. Did you notice how the pronoun shifts? I'm going to tell you what God has done for me. He has brought us to a spacious place. The psalmist is a part of a people. He is not an individual. He can't separate what God has done for him from what God has done for his neighbors, for his ancestors, for his people, for Israel. He cannot separate himself from his people. They're all in it together. That is the true way to understand what it is to be a human being created by God. We are made for and with each other. You are not an individual. You are a part of something. You're a part of something because you are a human being, and we only become human together. Anyhow, bit of a sidebar. The first way to read the psalm is to see it as a list of things to be thankful for, this act of joyful thanksgiving. God saved our lives. His praise was on my lips. The second way is hidden inside the first way. I will tell you what God has done for me, for us. I'll tell you what he did to us. Here's what you did, God. You trapped us in a net. You placed a heavy burden on our backs. You let our enemies run over us. You burned us down with fire, and you nearly drowned us in the sea. That's what you did. That's what God did. He nearly crushed us. I cried out to him with my tongue. It's a bitter litany, the second way to read this. This list of afflictions. That's such a theological word, affliction. An affliction has to be imposed by someone. So who afflicted Israel? Who afflicted the psalmist? Who caused him so much pain? Well, you know the answer, because the psalm just told us. God did. That's what he's saying here. That's what the psalmist is saying. You nearly burned us to death. You nearly drowned us in the sea. You turned a blind eye to thousands and thousands of COVID deaths. A 12-year-old boy died this week. You won't let us worship in the same room. You are keeping us trapped in our homes. You're causing us to lose our jobs. You're letting people die alone. That's what you did. We don't pray that way. I certainly don't pray that way. I don't cry out to God with my mouth. Our prayers tend to be tender, halting, humble, whispered. We don't stand before God and say, you afflicted us with this pandemic. The psalmist does. He doesn't hold a thing back. Thanks and a bitter complaint. Hope and despair, love and resentment, they are all wrapped up together in this prayer. He doesn't try to deny God's power in order to save God's goodness. That's what I do, not the psalmist. He doesn't even see gratitude and complaint as different categories. Everything that is, rain and drought, life and death, all of it, comes to us from the hand of God. Existence fits within a single category. Credit and blame are indistinguishable from one another. Holding then credit and blame in total unity dissolves both categories. All you have is God, which is soothing. Suddenly, God is here. It's also fearful, and it might be wrong. I want to argue with this psalm. That's what I would like to spend the rest of this sermon doing. But is not a wise move. Right now, roiled by this pandemic, we need God, not theology. So I'm not going to waste our time or waste this moment speculating about whether God is able to make a rock so heavy she cannot carry it. When all you have is God, and you believe that she loves us, you begin to feel her working, shaping, refining us right now through this crisis. As the poet Kay Ryan asks, if we have not struggled as hard as we can at our strongest, how can we know what sustains us the longest? If we have not struggled as hard as we can at our strongest, how can we know who sustains us the longest? Come and hear, all you who fear God. Let me tell you what he has done for me. He has refined us like fire. Look at the green unfolding beneath the flames of this controlled pollen burn. The fire refines. We are in a crisis. That's a Greek word. In New Testament Greek, the word crisis is a synonym for judgment. We are in a judgment. We're in a moment that exposes and clarifies. We are being shaped, stripped to our essence, refined by fire. Let me tell you what God has done for me. He refined us like fire. In 1871, St. Paul's had a gorgeous building. Our congregation was still an immigrant congregation, 100%. We didn't speak English. We began in this building, this little log cabin. It was our home in the 1840s. A few decades later, we were in this building at the corner of LaSalle and Ohio, near downtown. Imagine how proud we must have been of that gleaming white church, how much work and sacrifice it took to build it. And then it went up in flames. It burned down in a couple of hours, burned to rubble in the Great Chicago Fire. Our congregation, all of us, we voted to rebuild on the exact same site, and the new building was dedicated 2 years later, debt-free. And to pay for it, members of St. Paul's sold their own homes, their own lots. Their homes had burned down, their lots near downtown. They sold those lots, they bought cheaper property north of there. They took the difference, they gave it to St. Paul's, and we rebuilt debt-free. We went through fire. God carried us through it. And we came out stronger than we were before, more dedicated to the church than we were before we felt the flames. During World War I, some of our members had to fight their own families in European trenches. Church members at home in Chicago were under great suspicion. We changed our name from German and became St. Paul's United Church. We met the culture and we let the culture change us. We were not going to let our language, the way we spoke, stifle Christ. It was painful. It must have been painful. And we came out more faithful than we were before the war. God carried us and made us faithful. In 1917, the Spanish influenza killed nearly 10,000 Chicagoans in just 8 weeks. As Jeff preached some months ago, St. Paul's lost dozens and dozens of church members. We were sorely afflicted, and we were determined to care for the people of our city. Look at this photograph. Of course, your eye immediately goes to the little boy standing on this pile of bleach boxes, box after box, which were being given away to help curb that disease. And if you look behind the pile of boxes and the little kid, you see this hulking monolith of a building that is St. Paul's Church, right at the corner of Orchard and Kemper. That's where we moved to. We were sorely afflicted in 1917. We grieved. God took that pain and used it to help us heal the city. God carried us into a greater love than we had before. During World War II, Old Pain rose up to sting St. Paul's again. FBI agents tried to hide in our pews during worship, monitoring every word for sedition, convinced that so large a gathering of immigrant Germans and their descendants must indeed be seditious. One of our pastor's daughters remembers back then, in those days, spotting the FBI agents in the sanctuary because they didn't take their hats off. But she also knew who they were because after worship each week, they would come to her family's home and grill her father. Many of our members rose up, at least some of them did, with a natural sort of resistance to this kind of government intrusion and oppression. And some of them wanted to double down on our German identity, fly the German flag in our sanctuary even. Others wanted to become more American than the 4th of July. Many of us changed our last names to anglicize them. Our church council voted to remove all flags from the St. Paul's sanctuary. We worship God, not nation. We are here to be Christ's body for all people. God took our pain and our confusion and our disagreement and used it to refine us, to clarify our identity, to make us even more faithful. God carried us through the war, and we came out of it ready to grow by leaps and bounds, determined to become a church for all people, which is just what we did. Thousands and thousands of new members joined this place in the 1950s. And all of those new members meant that we needed a bigger home. And so members of St. Paul's sacrificed and raised in today's dollars millions of dollars to refurbish our sanctuary, to build a new organ, to add the entire wing, which is just behind me, the gym, classrooms, the chapel, the parlor, locker rooms, the stage, all of it. We saved and we sacrificed. And in 1955, when all of this work was complete, more than half of our building, including the entire sanctuary, burned to the ground on Christmas night. The logic of white flight urged St. Paul's to move to the suburbs after the building was destroyed. Instead, we heard God calling us to rebuild at Orchard and Kemper. We were eager to meet the needs of the city, eager to meet the needs of our changing neighborhood. And so we built a new sanctuary, and we built one that feels less heavy than the Germanic, dark room we had before. Less dated, modern. You've been in the room, imagine it now. The sanctuary. It is full of light. It feels new still. God called us to change, and St. Paul's adapted. We were refined by that fire. Our essence began to shine. This church probably wouldn't, Jeff has pointed this out, probably wouldn't be as strong as we are today if we hadn't had that fire in 1955. In the 1960s and 70s, our members and neighbors began to move out of the city. In steep decline, freeways newly constructed, carrying everybody out to the western suburbs in steep decline, we used our savings to retain a full staff. Shaped by all of the history that God had carried us through, we refused to be a dying church. We refused to be a dying church. We held faith. We kept at it. We knew that God would bring us back. With Tom Henry as our senior pastor, we had a great resurgence in the 1980s. St. Paul's was determined, and once again the church grew by leaps and bounds. In those days, we started the shelter and we started a preschool. We touched thousands of lives. We became an integral part of this community. We met its needs and we grieved with the grieving. Between 1987 and 1993, our pastors officiated 52 funerals for people who died from HIV/AIDS. 52 people, including our own music director. Some were church members. Others had been rejected by their own churches. God called us to their side. God changed us through our pain and through our love. We became, after all those funerals, the 40th open and affirming church. Actually, we became open and affirming in the midst of all those funerals. In 1989, one of the first churches in the world, St. Paul's was prophetic. God made us prophetic. God used pain to shape us again. And when the culture caught up with us, when straight people started looking for a church that was gay-friendly, we were ready. God prepared us to defy the odds, to buck the trends, and to stay strong. In a moment now, when churches across the nation and the city are in decline, St. Paul's is alive. Alive. God does not want St. Paul's to be undone by this pandemic. God will not let St. Paul's be undone by this pandemic. God will carry us through it, and God will use it to shape us, to refine us like fire. All of that might seem good. All of it might seem like a good thing. All of it might seem like my job to tell the story of this place. My job, which doesn't necessarily have a whole lot to do with your lives, aside from where you might come and spend some time on Sunday morning. But, well, before I get to but, I understand that feeling. Good but remote, right? The church, unrelated, as strong and good as it might be, unrelated to the pain of being isolated right now in a care facility, unrelated to the hassle of trying to educate your 6-year-old while trying to satisfy your boss at the same time, day after day after day, unrelated to the fear of becoming infected, unrelated to the prospect of losing your job. It all makes sense. But it stops making sense the moment you refuse to consent to be an individual. That line of thinking, the church strong, here, me and my life, afraid, terrified, here. It stops making sense the moment we refuse to consent to be an individual and realize that instead we are a part of one another. We are a part of a community that God has refined before and carried through much worse than this. You are a part of a people. You are not alone. You belong to a grieving, afflicted, healed, and healing, strong, faithful, adaptable, determined, prophetic, living church. That is who you are. That is who we are. We've been refined by fire. We have been through hard times and we have come out of them stronger than we were before our affliction. We are being carried by God. You have been through hard times before. You have, and you have come out of them stronger than you were before they began, before you were afflicted. And all of this means that God is carrying you, has carried you. God is carrying us. You are grieving, afflicted, healed, and healing. You are strong, faithful, determined, prophetic, alive. That's who we are. Amen.